Welcome to episode 2 of Raise the Bar with me, Daryl LaBar. In episode 1, we started to look at an XRM Toolbox plugin, and we never got around to actually looking at the plugin itself. So now in episode 2, we're going to pick up right where we left off. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing that catches my eye when I look at this is this naming convention here. It's very standard, nothing wrong with it, it's just not my personal preference, and I'll explain why here. So in this case, I have the SRM control. It stands for the Security Role Members Control. When I like to case these things, I like to case these things without having the capital letters together. And the primary reason that I do that, the primary reason I don't like that casing together, is if you're dealing with something that has lots of many words together that are capitalized. Let's say you're doing, my XRM Toolbox plugin SRM control. You have absolutely no idea when one huge concatenation actually begins and the other one ends. But if you do actually use the casing here, my XRM Toolbox SRM Security Role Manager plugin. So if you do it that way, at least you have a hope at figuring out what the difference is between when your parts of your words actually start and when they actually stop. So I'm going to change the capitalization for that to just the SRM control. Now I know XML is written like this lots of times. I prefer this just because it keeps with my standards. You also know that XRM here is done that way as well. And also this is very important, especially for Jonas, is the capitalization here of XRM Toolbox. It's a capital X lowercase rm. So I'm just gonna, that's my convention. I find it to be more readable in some cases. Again, I wouldn't ask anybody to change it if this was an actual code review, but just wanted to explain what I'm thinking here. So next thing I look at is I'm seeing lots of using directives I don't need. Just go ahead and remove those. Okay, next thing I'm seeing here is that we have this my settings here that is never actually used. Looks like it used to be used and it got commented out. I know this code base was taken from something that already existed and kind of hacked together, so I'm just going to remove the things that aren't actually being used, just so we know what we actually need to focus on for this plugin. So remove that. I'm going to do a quick scan through the code, see if I see anything else that looks like it's not being used. These aren't being used, and the reason I can tell that is this slight graying here just means it's not being used. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those as well. And generally, you'd want to know why aren't they being used, but for the purpose of this, I'm just going to delete it. Let's go through and look at the rest of what we got. We have our load here. We're not doing anything in, but we do have the actual handler for that. Our close, which actually closes the tool. This is pretty standard. One thing most people don't realize is you can actually middle click on the tabs as well, so you don't have to always click the close button. One thing that annoys me as well in WinForms development is that these methods begin with lowercase because that's how they're actually defined on the control itself. So I'm going to leave that because you can always go back and forth, but generally when I actually name my controls, I try to follow the standard convention for naming properties and methods, not for naming WinForm controls, so that makes sense. But that is the way that gets generated. I'm just going to go through and clean all these other warnings that we have here to see if they make sense or don't make sense. Okay, I've gone through and removed the simple issues with code that weren't really mentioning, but this is one I do want to mention here, and this is the lowercase g in the get user role. Now you'll find this a lot when you're switching back and forth, or at least I do when I'm switching back and forth between JavaScript and C#, because in JavaScript, functions should be lowercase to begin with. In C#, they should begin with an uppercase. So this may be a result of that, or just maybe a result of looking at the name the function was being called from and doing that. I don't know, but I'm going to switch that to be an uppercase here. And while we're looking at this method here, here's something that's very interesting that I see a lot of C# programmers do here. And this is the whole idea that strings are immutable. You can't change them. So when you go through and you concatenate lots and lots of strings, you're going through and adding them all together lots and lots of times. Well, that's and then it's having to recreate a string each and every time. That's generally not a good thing. It's going to use up lots of CPU and some memory as well. So the solution to that is use the string builder, which then kind of doesn't actually concatenate into one until you actually call build at the end, or toString, I mean, at the end. But the problem is, the C# compiler is smart enough now that it sees all these concatenations of string literals together, not string variables, but string literals, so there's no variables, it is that string. It will actually compile that string at compile time into a single string. Therefore, you pay the penalty of having to do that compilation once at the compile time, and then when you're running it, it actually runs faster. So in this case, or for that reason, for the most part, I don't ever use a string builder unless I'm dealing with strings that aren't string literals. So in this case, I'm going to go through and replace this string builder function with what the string literal version will be. Now here's a tooltip that you may or may not know about in Visual Studio. It happens also in VS Code. Even Notepad++ will do this. Hold down the Alt button. You can now select things in a multi-line, and you can edit it in a multi-line. And so I just deleted all those things like that. And I have this other issue of, okay, I have all these ending parentheses. How do I deal with that? So this is a case where I actually use Notepad++ to kind of help me in this case. And really all I want to do at this point in time is remove these extra ending parentheses and semicolons. So I'm going to start that cursor at the very beginning and use this record macro button up here, push end, delete the 2 characters that I want, go back to home to go to the beginning, and then go down. I'm going to push stop, and now I can push playback, and that's going to go through and do that for every single one of my lines. Copy paste, and boom. Now I've gone through and removed all those values, right? So that helps to clean it up a little bit. Dealing with Fetch XML, I always try to go through and make it as readable as possible and as copy-paste friendly as possible. So in this string here, we do actually have a actual non-literal value here. We actually do have a parameter here. I'm going to go ahead and change this to be a value that's getting passed in via interpolation. And so that I've done that, I need to actually go through first and replace all of the double quotes with single quotes. And then I need to get rid of all the double quotes at the end. So let's go back to our Notepad++. There's all of them. There's another cool feature in Notepad++. It used to have a plugin manager. It came for free. Now you've got to download that separately. But in here there's XM tools. You can do pretty print. There's a pretty print version of what that XML is, which is kind of nice. Now when I'm actually putting it back into my code, it should be a lot cleaner and prettier than what it used to be. I did forget to add my $sign here, because that's going to be my string interpolation. And now my role ID here, the ItaliCense, actually shows up as it's going to get replaced here. And now that Fetch XML is much cleaner to read. That's some additional indentation, which is great. And now you can copy and paste this much easier into something else without having to go through and work at it so much. So that's that Fetch XML. Don't need to call to string anymore. Don't need my string builder anymore. Okay. Underscore role ID. See, I thought that was an actual module level variable. So I'm going to change it to just role ID. Generally, it's a good idea whenever you're dealing with names of parameters to keep them the same throughout the whole method structure. Since you're passing in this role ID, that should be the same name. In the case of doing the retrieve multiple request, the Fetch XML query, again, like vars, that's my preference, not necessarily right or wrong. And a collection. In all of my code that I reference my NuGet packages, I always create extension methods on the iOrganization service to be able to call that and get the result back without having to cast it all the time. So I won't show that here, but that's just nothing to do. You don't need the parentheses when you're dealing with the object initialization. Clear, and then we could reduce this by getting rid of the if statement there. Now here's a case where the string builder actually makes sense because they're not string literals, are actually different strings that are having to get concatenated together. So this initialization could be a lot cleaner. So you could just initialize this like this. Get rid of the R's. Cool. So that's our actual string initialization for a string array. And we can even get rid of that as an option as well. I'm going to leave that there for now. And then our list view item. So that's an array of items. We pass that in. we never actually do anything with this string reader, so I guess I can delete it. That probably is just for debugging purposes. And let's go back up the top, see what else we missed here. So we have our get roles method. For working with WinForms, whenever you're doing calls that could take a while, you always want to do those calls on a separate thread from the UI thread, or else it just gets hung. And so that's what this work async logic was. This was my one contribution back in the day, was to put this sort of logic in the plugin base, where you just have to go through and define this asynchronous info to define what you're doing. So you have the actual worker that runs, what the actual work is, and then you have the actual callback method that gets called whenever the work's done, sort of thing. And that's all handles the different threads and stuff for you. So that's how that works. We have load roles, and then a post callback of looking at the args to see if there's any error, and again, stuff that isn't doing anything. So we'll just delete that as well. This calls load roles. So it accepts nullable GUID. Do we even pass anything in? No, we don't. Do we ever get called anywhere else? Don't think so. Okay, interesting. So what is that GUID for? Never used. Don't need it. Okay, we have our list view here of items that we clear. Create our new role manager. So this is the thing that we were going through and editing in episode 1. Get the roles, all roles. Okay, so this is being stored in a property. There's no reason this should be a class level variable. So let's make that a local variable. The selected item is change. This method gets called here. So generally, let me actually go through and do this change real quick here. I find it a little more readable to rename the methods the way that I want to name them, and then put all the event handlers at the bottom. Whenever you add a new event handler, it shows up for the bottom anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and make a region for that here. Here's another thing that I've done as well. My snippets, I always like my beginning region and ending region to have the same comment. This isn't necessarily required and isn't included by default, but I do it just because when I'm going through reading the code, I know what the next region above me actually is. So if you ever want to do that, I guess I'll take a quick look at doing that. So in your documents folder under Visual Studio, and it's whatever version of Visual Studio you're using, each one is going to have a separate folder for snippets. You have code snippets, and then for each language you can have your own code snippets in here. So in here I have that region snippet. If I edit that in my Notepad++, we'll see there's some header information here. Pretty much is all the same. There's even some tools that you can run to create your own snippets and to generate all this for you. It's not too terribly difficult, but here's the actual part that does the snippet that says, hey, give me my region end and region begin and region end, and whatever name that I type in, copy it down here, and then when I'm done, then I want to end on that new line there. So that's how that works. So now I have my event handler regions, and now I can put all my event handlers in here. Now I'm going to use a tool. This is actually called Ditto, but it's just a clipboard manager. Where I'm going to go through and copy. It takes whenever I copy something, it puts it in there, so that way I don't have to worry about losing it. I'm going to go through and add in all those event handlers, because I only had 4 there. Alright, so now we've got all of our event handlers back. And now I can actually put in my own naming style warning here. And ignore it just for this event handler section. So now that we've moved them, I'm actually going to name the methods that I want it to be and then call them from there. So this is the list view roles item selected change, and this is going through, showing a message box, and then getting the users for roles. And okay, so I'd probably just name this thing handle selected role change. And we can reduce our if statement here. A whole bunch of strings here I don't necessarily need. And then our close tool. Cool. So all those things already have those methods, and we can just collapse all those and know that there's no logic in there. It's just those event handlers. Okay, so here's one thing that you could potentially change. Convert to an if. When I first started doing this syntax, it's like, I'm not sure I like it, but it shouts to me now that this is not like an if statement with logic in here. If I go back and look at this, I've got to look at each line to see what is it actually doing. In this line, I know I'm going to return something, and I'm just going to return something different based on that initial value. So the equals is great. I try to avoid, if at all possible, it makes sense at least, having a knots in here, because it's much more readable if you have equals rather than having to put knots in here. So the only difference here is whether the x comes first or the y comes first. But it's the same exact text each case, right? I'm just going to make this a little more readable here. And now I can replace this with this. The only thing this is doing is you have an extra bit of code you don't have to repeat. So we head back to this original situation here. You had to look at it very intently to see what was the difference, and were they all using columns? Was one using rows? You didn't necessarily know. Here you know very clearly, without having to spend much energy, at least for your brain to spend much energy, is x text, y text, x text. Fairly simple. Here's the case where I probably would do something like this. Just get that very first one out, because we know the count already equals 1, and then I don't have to be using the indexing here twice. So again, this is probably just for debugging purposes. So I'm actually going to comment that out, because I don't think they want that role ID name stuff selected there. Generally, I really don't like having this class in here, and I dislike it so much, I'm going to actually move it out to its own class. Okay, so that's the name of the actual class file. But the name of the class, we still want it to be internal to this other one, right? Make this a partial class. And it's not this class is the SRM control class. Clean up everything that's not needed. Now we have much less code in a single file, which means that you don't have to look through all the other things that you're trying to abstract away, but you still has to be internal just to that class, because now it's partial. Partial class just means that you're splitting that class up among multiple files. And by default, this is what's required for WinForms to work, because we have our actual backend designer class here, which goes through and, oh, it's in French, great, which goes through and lists all of the actual code generated attributes and controls on the form. All right, let's do a compare between what we had now and what we had before. So first thing we notice here is we went from 307 lines of code down to 138 lines of code, which is fairly decent, except this all got moved somewhere else. So really we went from 232 down to 138. But just by having all that extra code gone, your code map is now even much more readable to see where you actually want to go at and look at when you're in the file itself. So I count that as a pretty nice little win for readability purposes. Let's go through it. Look at our methods here. Do anything in load rules. We move some of these handler events down to the bottom. And the one that probably changed the most here is our get users role, which used to have all the string builder. So this is very hard to see because you have no indentation help here at all. You can't copy and paste in the Fetch XML builder and say, hey, what does this actually return? Yeah, it just makes it very difficult to deal with. So hopefully just learning this little trick will simplify your code, make it more readable, and be a positive improvement going forward. So here's something that we may do here. So WinForms have a begin update method and a end update method. What that basically does is that keeps it from trying to redraw all the time. In this case, I'm going to use a try family without a catch. And you're asking, why would I do that? Well, I want to ensure that no matter what happens here, if I have any sort of error, I end my update and allow it to be refreshed. Probably isn't that big of a deal, and I even had someone ask once, what's a try finally ever good for? It doesn't make any sense. Well, in this case, here's an example when I'm using it, and I just don't want to actually I don't want to handle the error in this case. I just want to make sure that I'm re-enabling what I just disabled, basically. So very, very minimal changes related to this. The biggest one by far is just this Fetch XML query here. And then this update here is minor. This begin update and update. Those are the changes. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Please leave any comments you have, and I am in need of code to review. So if you have any code in an open source project, or even something at work that you can give me a signed letter that you're okay with me using it and posting it and all that kind of fun stuff, that works too. I'm looking for plugins, looking for JavaScript code, looking for workflow, custom workflow activities, whatever you got, I'm happy to look at, and would love to help raise the bar for myself as well as everyone else. Thank you.